Good evening, everyone. I'm Sissy Silva, Senior Manager of Programs and Spanish Resources at Cancer and Careers, and I'm so happy to welcome you to today's webinar. For those of you who are listening from your phone, please let us know by sending an email to cancerandcareers@cew.org with your name and phone number you'll be dialing in from. That way we can confirm your attendance and make sure you receive all the relevant info and materials following the webinar. Now, for those of you that don't know us, Cancer and Careers is a national nonprofit and the only program of its kind solely dedicated to empowering and educating people with cancer to thrive in their work environments. All of our programs and services we offer are provided free of charge. Our comprehensive website, available in both English and Spanish, is at the heart of everything we do. There, you can find various support services, including our resume review service and access to career coaches. We also offer a collective diary as a place to share feelings, thoughts, and ideas that may help to inspire and validate other visitors to our site. Our educational blog and newsfeed are both rich resources where those who have been diagnosed, their caregivers, employers, and healthcare professionals can stay current on topics related to work and cancer. Additionally, our publication library provides tangible, easy to digest information on working and looking for work after a cancer diagnosis. Titles are available in both English and Spanish, and they can be ordered or downloaded from our website, again, all free of charge. We also offer a number of free events throughout the year, both hour-long webinars like this one, as well as full-day events, which I'll talk about at the end of the presentation. Now, a few key things related to accreditation. And for those of you who do not require this information, please bear with me. I'll make this as fast as possible. Today's virtual conference is accredited for CEs by the Association of Social Work Boards, the New York State Education Department State Board for Social Work, the American Nurses Credentialing Centers Commission on Accreditation, and the California Board of Registered Nursing, and is accredited for PDCs for HR professionals by SHRM. If you plan on receiving continuing education credits for this program from any of these accrediting bodies, please proceed with the following steps. First, you must log on or call individually. Participants who listen in on someone else's line will not receive credit. Second, within 2 weeks of this event, you must complete and submit the evaluation and receive a passing score of 80% or higher on the post-test. The link to the evaluation will be shared at the conclusion of the webinar, so please take the time to complete them at that point. But if you're unable to complete it today, a follow-up email with the link to the eval and post-test will be sent tomorrow, Thursday, September 14th by 5 p.m. Eastern. All this information can be found in more detail on our website. And for those of you planning to request continuing education credits, our accrediting bodies require us to share this slide and let you know that there are no conflicts of interest to report. As you might know, Zoom has a lot of great features you can use to interact with the event and with us and other attendees. If you have any questions about today's content, please submit them by clicking on the Q&A box below. We know the importance of privacy, so there's an option to submit your questions anonymously. We'll do our best to answer everyone's questions, but please be patient. If we don't get to your question today, please send us an email at cancerandcareers@cew.org. You'll also see a chat in the features panel. Our goal is to keep you as engaged with the content and presentation as possible. Remember, this is separate from the Q&A box. We'll also be posting some messages in the chat box, so keep an eye out for those. And an important thing to know is that the chat box is not private, and we'll show your first and last name. So just please keep that in mind when and if you decide to engage in the chats. Also, as a general reminder, all questions should be submitted via the Q&A feature, not the chat box. Thanks in part to direct support from Genentech and QVC, Cancer and Careers is able to offer this 9th annual year of the Balancing Work and Cancer webinar series. This program was created to provide patients and survivors, as well as their care teams and employers, with concise information about the work-related issues that arise after a cancer diagnosis. Additionally, we'd like to recognize Cancer and Careers year-round sponsors who support all of our core programs and allow us to continue providing all resources and services free of charge. Now, for today's presentation on communicating effectively, solid communication skills are invaluable in so many aspects of one's life, whether it's getting information from your doctors and care team, to collaborating on a project at work, or selling yourself to a potential employer in a job interview. The skills you learn this afternoon will help you in many aspects of your life. To guide you along this conversation, I'd like to introduce you to Rachel Becker. Rachel is Deputy Director of Cancer and Careers and is one of our in-house social workers. She has been with CAC for 8 years, having previously worked as Head of Client Services at Care Planners, as well as in a clinical capacity at the New York Presbyterian Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, as well as the Jewish Child Care Association of New York, and completed a fellowship in psycho-oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Following Rachel's presentation, there will be time for a Q&A, so please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box. Now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Sissy. And welcome, everyone. We're so happy that you decided to join us this evening. Maybe it's this afternoon where you are. And either way, we're really glad that you're here. And as you know, this is the first of 2 sessions that we're going to be presenting this fall that are focused on communications on the job or when job hunting. And so today was designed to define some terms and ideas and overall start to really think about that big picture of what it means to be an effective communicator. And then the next session is going to have a more rubber meets the road kind of feel to it, where we're going to talk about some tips and tools that can be useful for putting these concepts into practice. But for today, as you can see on this slide, our discussion is going to focus on understanding effective communication, why it's important. We'll talk about personal communication styles and what they are and how to identify yours and others. And we'll also start exploring the topic of disclosure and things to consider when making disclosure-related decisions. So let's jump right into exploring that big picture and why it's important to think about what it means to communicate effectively in the context of life after a cancer diagnosis. Now, while our big focus for today is going to be on strategic communications related to work, both actually on the job and when looking for a new job, it's important to note that there are areas outside of work where you might need to or want to use some deliberate communication strategies as well. For example, and I'm guessing that many of you have already experienced this, if not all of you, it can be very helpful to prepare for any conversations you may be having with your healthcare team, because there's often a limited amount of time available during appointments, or if you're admitted to the hospital and the doctor drops by during rounds. Preparing a list of questions you have or topics you'd like to discuss can help ensure you make the best use of limited time you have with them. Similarly, some conversations with family or other loved ones may benefit from advanced preparation, such as if you're sharing news about your diagnosis or updates about your treatment plan. It can also be important to think strategically about what you post online, whether that's on social media or in a blog or really anywhere else you might be posting, since our online behaviors can have a real impact on our work lives. And we're going to spend much more time talking about that over the course of these 2 sessions. So as we move forward, I encourage you to be open to the idea that while a lot of the concepts we're going to talk about are being shared under the umbrella of job or job search related, they may also be used effectively in other areas of life as well. Another place in your post-diagnosis life where it may be helpful to apply some communication strategies has to do with recasting yourself in terms of how others around you may view or behave towards you as a result of what's going on medically. So at Cancer and Careers, we frequently hear from people who are concerned that having shared a diagnosis, they're always going to be seen as the cancer person in their workplace. And often this leads them to wonder if there's anything that can be done to help shift their coworkers' focus so that they're once again seen as that full and robust human that they are, who brings tons of work skills to the table, as well as personality and interests and so on and so forth. There are also people who come to us wanting to know if there's a nice professional way to say to their coworkers or supervisors, hey, could you please stop always bringing up my cancer, which can be an understandably frustrating situation and kind of tricky to address, particularly if it's clear that the people asking about what's going on with your health have good intentions, but just aren't considering how the question might be making you feel. And of course, there are numerous other challenges to communication you might find yourself facing in a work context as well. We have a few common ones listed on the slide here. And I'd like to now invite all of you to share any specific communication challenges you've faced at work, or if you're a healthcare professional, a challenge that someone with a diagnosis has told you about. And reminder here, of course, again, what Sissy shared earlier, that the chat box is not private. So keep that in mind if you're concerned about your privacy. And of course, it's also totally fine if people are not feeling so much like they want to share. So, oh, chemo brain. Yes. Yes. So I think chemo brain can certainly provide a challenge in terms of communication. We often hear from people who talk about losing their train of thought mid-sentence or things along these lines that are frustrating for them and can often be experienced as embarrassing. So that is a very common one. Thank you for sharing that. I had my annual review today and told I didn't handle stressful situations right after my diagnosis. Oh, Ingrid, that is a hard one to hear. If you want to, as these are coming in, if I want to quickly mention that if any of you have experienced something at work that you'd like to talk to one of us at Cancer and Careers about, I'm a social worker. We have some other social workers on staff, and you can always reach out to us and we can talk through what may have happened and how you might handle it better. My workplace has been excluding me because I have a lot going on or acting like nothing was impacting me and that I should be at 100%. That is so frustrating. Yes. Advocating for myself is tough. And yes, brain fog on top of that. Indeed. So I think what we're seeing in all of these responses, and certainly feel free to keep them coming, is that challenges are common around communication. And that's one of the reasons why we pulled this webinar together, because we felt it was so important to be able to give you some tools to address some of these moments that are maybe not so intuitive to address. Certainly some topics are more difficult to talk about than others, and sometimes it's difficult to know how to start a conversation. And that's certainly the case, but something that I think is a really important point to make here is that everyone comes up against communication challenges in their lives, regardless of who they are or what their job is or their level of education or their health status or any other aspects of identity. We all face communication challenges in our lives. So you are not alone, and you are not experiencing these things simply because of a diagnosis. You are experiencing them through the lens of a diagnosis. And there are tools that we can use to assist with all of this. So let's continue to look at some of the communication basics so that we can move forward with a shared understanding of some terms and concepts. So we're going to start very at brass tacks with what is communication. And one definition is that communication is a process through which information, ideas, or shared and or emotions are shared between two or more people. In other words, it's what gives us the power to meaningfully connect with others. And it can occur in a number of ways. It may happen through audible communications like spoken words. It may also involve sounds that are nonverbal and not actually words like grunting or sighing. But of course, not all communications are received through our ears. They may be written out or shared through sign language. And our behavior around others and our body language can also convey information or clues about what we're thinking or feeling. And it's also important to note that sometimes communications are able to happen in a way that are thought out and deliberate, but that is not always the case. I'm certainly thinking about our friend who was told that she didn't handle things well right after her diagnosis, which is a time where I think often, people are in a place where there's a lot of emotion at the surface and thinking and reacting. So, very common that you might have some of those unplanned communication moments during that pocket of time. And then, of course, it's also the case that sometimes details get shared with others subconsciously without us even knowing that we're doing it. Like when we're nervous and our hands start shaking or we start tapping our foot repeatedly. So really wide variety of things that may fall under the umbrella of communication. And before we define what specifically effective communication is, I'd like to challenge some common misconceptions about it. So we have a number listed on this slide, specifically that, some people think that effective communication is black or white. You're either born a good communicator or you're not. And there are certainly people who are born with a knack for communicating. Communicating well is a skill, which is why we're here today to talk about the skills. Another misconception is that full disclosure is the best policy. And while there may be truth to the idea that honesty is the best policy, it's not always the best approach to share absolutely everything. We're going to talk more about that. Talking is the only way to effectively communicate. We obviously just touched on that one. And another misconception is that we are only ever given a single chance for an effective communication, that you've got your one shot and then you lose it. And that is so rarely the case, particularly when it comes to work-related conversation. And we're going to unpack that and all of these ideas as we move through today and our next session as well. So thinking about what makes communication effective, the first key concept to consider is that effective communication is a two-way street. It involves both sharing our thoughts and ideas, while also investing energy in receiving and absorbing the ideas that are being shared by whomever else we're communicating with. This means not only being mindful to get across our own perspective in a way that's clear and organized, but really paying attention to what the other person is trying to get across to us and considering what they're bringing to the table in terms of their own perspective. So asking clarifying questions becomes incredibly important to make sure that you understand what's being communicated. Expressing gratitude when it's appropriate is also a best practice so that people, it's clear that we appreciate the time, the thought, the energy that's going into the communication. Another best practice can be summarizing what was discussed at the end of a conversation. So this might mean taking a minute or two before ending a phone call to review what next steps are, or it might mean sending an email after the fact to say, thanks for the conversation earlier and to recap what was discussed. And then there's a bulleted list of what was discussed. And this is tied to the idea that we brought up to the last slide, which is that effective communication isn't necessarily limited to being a one-time event. It should be something that happens regularly. And we can all probably relate to the idea that life in general and our work tasks or projects and so on are all continuously evolving, sometimes in unexpected ways. So regular check-ins, whether they're 5-minute overviews or longer deep dives, are often necessary to make sure communications are as beneficial as possible to everyone involved. In fact, it's important to note that sometimes communications very purposely are structured to take place in more than one conversation. Effective communication also incorporates emotional regulation, which means having the goal of staying centered so that what you're feeling doesn't play too much of a role in how you're expressing yourself. This is particularly important when we think about work communications. And it's not to say that emotion doesn't have its place at work. It does. We're going to talk about that, but it's about finding the regulation. Asking for help when you need it is also an essential part of communicating effectively. Every single person on this planet, no matter their health status or their job title or any other personal characteristic, needs help from time to time. So asking for it shouldn't be something that you shy away from, particularly in a work context. And of course, effective communications should result in a clear understanding of any next steps, as we discussed. Moving on to why effective communication is important on the job, particularly after a cancer diagnosis. For one, it helps to keep the lines of communication open. The vast majority of us who work do not do so in a vacuum. Yes, there are some people who are sole proprietors, and a lot of their work they may do by themselves, but we usually are somehow collaborating with others in order to get our job done, whatever it is that we're doing for work. And the best way to make sure that everyone knows what they should be doing, when, how, all of that, is to make sure that there's free movement of information and ideas back and forth on a regular basis. Effective communication on the job can also eliminate questions or assumptions that lead to anxiety or mistrust. So, for example, for those of you who might have a desk job and are working remotely, and if you're going to step away from your computer for more than a few minutes, it can be a good idea to send an instant message to your team to let them know that you're not going to be available for a little while, so that if somebody reaches out and doesn't get you, they don't make the assumption that you're taking a nap or sitting on your couch eating bonbons or whatever they might assume. In fact, getting in the habit of regularly communicating can actually build a sense of confidence or reassurance about who you are as a worker. So that if you do accidentally at some point step away from that computer and forget to tell your team, the default assumption is going to be, oh, something must have happened. I'm sure they're going to be back in a minute. But with all of that said, what's really essential to remember as you're thinking about communicating strategically is that you do not have to be a completely open book about everything going on in your life. You can make choices about what specific details get shared, or if some don't get shared, or if nothing gets shared at all. And we're going to circle back on that in a few slides. Effective communications are also important during a job search. First, clear communication is absolutely key to opening the door to potential interviews, whether it's through networking or a cover letter or well-constructed resume or CV. What it boils down to is using these communications to help people understand what kind of job you're looking for, who you are, and what you bring to the table. It's also the case that most pre-interview communications, like the ones I just listed, involve making the best possible use of a limited amount of space. Cover letters shouldn't be more than a few paragraphs. Both resume and LinkedIn profiles should be succinct. And in networking, it's smart to know how to quickly share details in real-time conversations. And then in terms of interviewing successfully, your overall goal, no matter who you are or what job you might be interviewing for, is always to communicate in a way that shows the person across the table or Zoom screen that you are the savviest, most qualified candidate for the role you're interviewing for, which is also a skill and something that should be practiced. And we're going to spend some more time talking about that in our next session. There'll be some digging into communications during a job search. How each of us goes about communicating can vary quite a bit from person to person. And it's based on individual factors such as personality, cultural background, the way we were raised, and so on. And the way a specific person expresses information or ideas is referred to as their communication style. Very important to note that there is no one correct communication style. And a good place to start figuring out what your individual communication style is to ask yourself what your feelings are about sharing. Some people are sharers and some people aren't. And both of those are valid perspectives. So whatever your particular feelings are about sharing or communicating overall or at work, sometimes we feel differently about sharing in our personal lives than we do in our workplace. It's all going to play a role in shaping your communication style, and it's helpful to be aware of. Now, when thinking about communicating at work, it's also smart to evaluate how your workplace culture impacts your feelings about communicating on the job. Is the environment like a second family where people joke around and share details about their weekends and their families? Or is the overall tone more corporate and buttoned up and laser focused on the task at hand? And how does this impact the way you do or don't communicate at work? Does it have an effect on your feelings about whether or not to disclose? Additionally, understanding what your own communication style is can help you become a much more effective communicator because it helps you to truly own your strengths in getting across information and ideas, as well as to be aware of the places where there's room for improvement or other things that you should be on the lookout for. And then beyond that, understanding the individual communication styles of the people around you can help you to know how to target your communications in a way that helps them to best understand your message, as well as things for you to keep in mind as you receive whatever messages they are sharing with you. And in case the way I explained that was a little confusing, we're now going to spend the next few slides going into more detail. So as you might imagine, a number of career coaches and other employment professionals have done some really good thinking about and research into communication styles. And among them is a man named Mark Murphy, who is an author and leadership coach who has developed a model that outlines 4 primary communication styles. Now, in talking about these 4 styles, Murphy says that there are 2 major philosophical differences that separate them. The first is that people tend to communicate either more with emotion and feelings or more with data, numbers, and facts. So for example, if you have 2 people working at an animal rescue, a more emotional communicator might say, I feel like we're doing well with our winter adoption push. Whereas a more data-driven communicator might say, 92% of the dogs we're currently fostering have received adoption applications. Both are saying something similar, but how exactly they're saying it is different based on their communication styles. So then the second difference has to do with the arc that people use to convey information. Do they go in a straight line, A to B to C and so on? Or do they share information in a more roundabout way, or even skip over details entirely? Now we're going to walk through what Murphy's 4 styles are. But before we do, a reminder that there are many, many ways of thinking about communication style. We just thought that this was a really strong example, which is why we wanted to share it with you today. And again, remember, no one of these 4 styles is better than another. They are all on equal footing here. The purpose is just to describe differences and empower you to understand your strengths and where other people are coming from. So the first communication style that Murphy identifies is the analytical communicator. And this is the person who uses facts and data to communicate versus communicating emotionally. They use precise language, and they tend to express themselves logically or in that straight A to B to C line that I was just talking about. Those are their strengths in terms of how they express themselves. On the other hand, some things for Some things for analytical communicators to be aware of include coming across to others as cold or unfeeling. And also not uncommon for people in this group to find themselves getting frustrated with something less specific or number driven, which might mean that they get a little brusque with their replies or even stop paying attention. And that can impact how effective communication ultimately is. So if you recognize yourself in this description, these may be things to work on. Another point to keep in mind if you're an analytical communicator is that it may be challenging for you to talk about the unknowns that come with a cancer diagnosis and treatment. Because as you may be able to relate to, the cancer experience is fluid and it doesn't always move in a straight line. So keep in mind that your strong ability to be logical and apply numbers might not be of service here. Next, we have the intuitive communicator. And this is someone whose strengths include both being able to describe the big picture succinctly and to cut right to the bottom line without giving a lot of detail, which can be very effective in certain work environments. That said, if this describes you, keep in mind that you may come across as impatient to others who do require details, either to get a point across or to fully absorb what's being shared. And then, as we think about how this might impact work communications during cancer, it's important to know that there may be times where a lot of details are necessary. So for example, if you're going to be out for a few weeks for surgery and a colleague is going to cover a project while you're out, handing it off to them may require that you really unpack the individual steps and components to make sure they have a full comprehensive understanding of how to successfully do what you need them to do. And yes, Catherine, this is a great point that you've made, that it's good to know how your boss and colleagues and loved ones also communicate and absorb info. I think it's often the case that we might experience something emotionally or take it personally when we don't think about how that other person is absorbing or communicating or all of these things. So really being able to have some curiosity about how the other people in your life are communicating is such an asset. So really great point. So you'll remember on the last slide, I mentioned people who really appreciate detailed communications. So Murphy calls them functional communicators. It's not necessarily the facts, data, and numbers that are analytical communicators like to use. Functional communicators like the kind of details that are required for planning in advance. They tend to communicate information in a very step-by-step way and are often sought out for their exceptional strategizing and organizational skills. However, if you fall into this category, you'll want to make sure you're sharing just the right amount of detail, not too much, because if you do, you can risk losing the other person's attention. Functional communicators should be mindful of oversharing during disclosure conversations. And so a helpful tip is to plan for those discussions to start with writing down everything that you might say, and then go back through and edit out details that aren't totally necessary right now. And we're going to discuss more about disclosures shortly. And I see, thank you, Tatiana, for jumping into the chat box there. We're going to talk about fluidity later too. And if we don't hit it, please make sure that you ask again during the Q&A. So the fourth of Murphy's communication styles is personal communicator. This is the group that most frequently uses emotion to communicate, which means they are strong empathizers. They listen well and are diplomatic, all of which are very challenging skills to teach, so wonderful traits to come by naturally. Plus, being emotional in a work context can be a positive. For example, feeling passionate about your work and letting that shine through can actually strengthen your communications. On the other side of the coin, personal communicators will want to be mindful about letting emotions overtake conversation. particularly heavier emotions. So it can be a good idea to write out notes or sort of script for yourself to keep you grounded during disclosure conversations if your feelings are starting to build. Also, if you know you'll be having a difficult conversation with a less emotional communicator, such as an analytical communicator, you might want to think through how that more muted behavior might impact you and how to navigate whatever feelings might come up. So that speaks to the point that I just made about how sometimes we take things personally that aren't personal, depending on what the other person's communication style is. So moving to the topic of disclosing your cancer diagnosis, as I've mentioned through today's session, it's important to be thoughtful and strategic when making decisions about when, how, and to whom you should disclose, or even if you should disclose at all, either at work or in other areas of your life. In fact, what we often encourage is developing a personal disclosure plan. And this isn't because there are right or wrong ways to share this information. It's because spending some time sitting with and thinking through the who, what, when, where, whys of sharing and making specific choices can help you feel more confident about and in control of the information about your personal story that's out there in the world. So what's involved with developing a personal disclosure plan? Well, first make clear decisions about what, if any, information about your cancer journey you're going to share and where. This includes both in-person conversations and online conversations. And then once you've made those decisions, communicate them with the people in your network, whether they're family and friends or people that you're connected to online. We frequently hear stories about well-intended or accidental online disclosures. And then, so try to get in front of those if you can. And even if you have shared your preferences with your loved ones, it's still a good idea to monitor what others are posting so you have a sense of what's out there. So often people reach out to us because they're not sure about whether or not there is a responsibility to disclose their diagnosis and or treatment plan and at work. So if you are wondering whether or not you have to share news of your diagnosis, you should know that although there can be exceptions, in most instances, there is not a requirement or an obligation to share your details about health or health history with an employer, nor can they ask. In most instances, again, there are some exceptions. Now, with all of that said, people may decide to disclose for a variety of reasons, and there can be both benefits and unwanted consequences with disclosure in the workplace, which makes it very important to understand how and why you're making the decisions that you're making, and stick to choices that feel right for you and your unique circumstances. Some things to ask yourself include: how will treatment interfere with your ability to perform your duties? We also talked about the legal benefits to sharing this information. We're not going to spend any real time today talking about workplace legal protections, but I will briefly say that sometimes it is necessary to share some information about your diagnosis to access protection under the law. Excuse me. Woo. Thank you. So as I was saying, we have a number of archived webinars on our website. Thank you for the bless you. We have a number of archived webinars on our website where you can learn more about workplace protections. And I've also included a link to an informational article on our website that has more details as well. So that said, it's important to note that people may want to disclose for a variety of reasons, not having to do with the law. For example, some people are sharers, and for them, it would feel very inorganic to keep something like a cancer diagnosis under wraps. Others feel very differently. They're much more private at work, either about their personal lives in general or medical information specifically. You may also want to think about whether anyone in your workplace has gone through something similar. So maybe that's not someone who's been through a cancer experience, but perhaps somebody who went out on maternity leave or someone who you know is a caregiver to an aging parent. It can be incredibly valuable to consider these experiences as you begin to think about what you can expect out of your own experience. We also get asked a lot, who should I tell? And that's going to vary depending on you and your specific circumstances. And it's also possible that you may find yourself having to have more than one disclosure conversation. So if that's the case, we recommend starting with a person that you're most comfortable. For many people, that's going to be a direct supervisor. But for others, actually, on that point, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of managers were not trained to be managers. In fact, arguably most of them. And so it's entirely possible when you sit down to have a disclosure conversation with a manager that they'll be having that conversation for the first time and feel a little in uncharted territory themselves. And that's not an ideal situation because it sometimes puts the burden on you to help teach your manager what to do next. In those circumstances, Cancer and Careers has a manager's toolkit that we created because so many survivors asked us for something concrete that they could take with them into these conversations with their supervisors. So that can be a really great thing for you to have on hand in these moments. For some people, sharing with a supervisor is not going to be the move, so they may want to go to HR. HR can be a really wonderful resource. They tend to know a lot of information about policies and things that can be beneficial and so on. But we also hear a lot of mixed stories about HR, to put it diplomatically. A lot of people do not have great experiences, so that's something to keep in mind as well. And then perhaps the most important thing to disclose in any of these conversations is the idea that treatment is going to be fluid. And so this is what came up earlier, but it cannot be said enough that help whomever you're talking to understand that the things you are sharing today are the things that are true today and the things that you know today, but they may not apply next week or next month or 6 months from now, and that this is likely to be an ongoing conversation. Now, when thinking about whether or not to disclose or how much to share, it's also important to consider what you know about the possible side effects you are likely to experience, particularly if you're choosing not to disclose either at all or widely. And this is because, of course, the changes that can be brought upon by treatment, changes to the body that are visible, like hair loss or skin changes, or invisible side effects such as cognitive changes or a decrease in overall energy levels, can often disclose that information, even if your words don't. So if you are someone who isn't planning to or has already decided not to disclose widely, it can be a good idea to have a sense of the types of changes you are likely to experience, and whether those might be perceived by your coworkers in a way that invites questions. And from there, it's about knowing how to have prepared responses to any questions that might arise so that you don't accidentally share information that you prefer to keep quiet. And as a little spoiler for the next session, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about prepared responses to questions and comments. So if you're not already registered for that session, I definitely recommend doing so. Now, if you do decide that you're going to disclose at work, the idea of simply getting the ball rolling in conversation-wise is one that can be intimidating for a lot of people, and that is very understandable. So here are a couple examples of how you might start that conversation. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to read them to you out loud. You can read them on the slide either now or after the session. But overall, the point is that when you're preparing to begin these conversations, you want to weave in the idea that you want to collaborate with your employer to create a plan that ensures both your needs and their needs are being met. And if any of the exact language that you see on this slide works for you, please feel free to use it. But the reality is, of course, that the exact same language isn't going to work for everyone because not everyone communicates the same way. So adapt it. Feel free to reach out to us to help you work on pre-prepared answers as well. Now, as you're thinking through all of this, it can be helpful to keep in mind that disclosure can be thought of as existing on a spectrum. We talked about the fact already that generally speaking, you're not required or obligated to share your health or health history with an employer, nor can they ask. However, we find that a lot of individuals with cancer understandably have the question about whether choosing not to share is essentially equivalent to lying. And so what I would offer you in response to that is that if this is a question that you have, recognize that the decision to not disclose cancer status is the choice to omit sharing personal information that isn't relevant to if you can do your job or how you do your job. It's not lying. And if you think about it, there are all sorts of pieces of personal information people choose to omit in work settings. For example, no one ever goes into a job interview and says, I chew gum all day when I'm working, and some of my past coworkers have found that annoying. Similarly, people experience all sorts of medical realities that they don't necessarily share with their employer, such as diabetes or heart disease, or if they're on birth control pills or antidepressants, which we know are incredibly common medications that people take, right? These are omissions, and they're omissions that are perfectly okay. It's also typically not an all or nothing scenario. You can usually start by sharing just a little piece of information that's relevant and then share more later if something becomes more relevant down the line. But of course, once something's out there, it can't really be unshared. So that's an important point to consider. And also, when deciding whether to share at work, consider what you know so far. And it's important to stick to what you know to be true now and not necessarily the what ifs. The what ifs can be very distracting in our own minds, and it can feel important to bring them up. But getting accurate information from your healthcare provider around timelines and treatment protocols can help with this. And try not to get too far ahead of yourself when having the conversation about how things may or may not play out. And the reason that we recommend this, and overall working in the idea of fluidity when you're having these conversations, is because it can be very uncomfortable to have to walk back a promise that you made early on before you knew how things were going to play out. It is much better to let people know up front that you are telling them what you know now, but that things may change, and you will communicate that to them if it does. Turning now to the topic of disclosure during a job search, this is a question that comes up frequently. Should I disclose my cancer diagnosis in a cover letter or resume, either as a way to explain a gap or as an example of skills and experience? And ultimately, your job search is yours, and it is up to you to conduct it in a way that feels right for you. However, I will also share with you that a number of studies that have been done show that people who disclose cancer or another medical issue or disability in a cover letter or on a resume are less likely to be called in for an interview. Obviously, we really wish that this weren't the case, but I bring it up as an important point to consider. And I encourage you to think about it this way. Every job search really amounts to a series of conversations. And it's wise to think out the purpose of each of these conversations and then think about where in the process disclosure might make sense. So what we typically recommend is that if it's really important to you to disclose during the job search process, wait until you have at least one in-person interview so that the interviewer can get a sense of who you are as a whole human, so that they're not just looking at something that you wrote on a piece of paper and just really seeing the piece of paper without the entire fabulous human who's sitting behind it. So we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the online space before we end for today. So we often hear about the role that the internet is playing in helping people through their cancer experience. For many, it creates a sense of community and a way to feel better in the moment. But it also creates a written record of information that can be difficult to get rid of. At the same time, research indicates that more and more hiring managers, and as I touched on the last slide, existing employers as well, are Googling prospective candidates and current employees respectively. This is not necessarily to find something negative, but rather to get additional information about the people that they work with, or to confirm something that they already like about a particular job candidate. But of course, it's still possible that they'll come across information that the person would prefer that the employer in question didn't know. So I want to be clear that I'm not saying never post anything online, because it can actually be a very good thing to have an online presence, but rather that it's important for people to have a better understanding of the virtual landscape so they can make informed decisions about how their story is being presented online. So this slide shares some data that came from our most recent Harris poll. We do the research every year, and it illustrates some feelings about and behaviors of people who have been diagnosed in regard to their social media behaviors. And you can see that, about a quarter of people did disclose their diagnosis online. Little less than a third said that they regret posting information about their diagnosis on social media. And then 41% expressed concern about their employer discovering their cancer diagnosis through social media. So if you are feeling any of these ways, know that you are not alone. So, excuse me. Sorry, my mouse is going crazy here. So this is a reminder of some of the things that we've already talked about. And as you're thinking through what's going to work best for you, it's a good idea to spend some time considering the potential long-term impact of online disclosure. It may be the case that some of you have already disclosed at work and everyone is being really supportive, and that's an outstanding situation to be in. But the fact is that the internet doesn't go away. So it's important to think beyond right now and consider possible long-term impact, because none of us can predict the future. So you may find yourself unexpectedly looking for a job 5 years from now, or your super supportive supervisor may move on and be replaced by someone who starts Googling their new staff. And there's no way to know how that person is going to respond to the information they find. So I want to be clear that I'm not saying never disclose online, rather that we want you to make informed choices that you feel good about. And so that's where we're going to leave things off for today. And before we move to Q&A, which we do have a few minutes for, I want to leave you with these top takeaways, which are that effective communication can be an important tool, either when working during treatment or looking for work. Understanding your communication style and others can help improve workplace conversations, and that it's critical to think through disclosure decisions and how they may impact work or communications. So Sissy is back, and we're going to move through some Q&A, but very quickly, this is when our Communicating Effectively Part 2 is going to be taking place, and this teases some of the topics that we're going to discuss. And then here we also have some upcoming virtual events listed here, including our Ask the Experts Spanish language virtual event series, which is Sissy's baby, and an opportunity to get to spend a lot more time with her. But in the meantime, we're going to move to this resource slide for all of you to look at while Sissy lets me know what's been going on in the Q&A box while we've been having this conversation.
Yes, and Rachel, thank you for amazing presentation. I cannot wait for part 2 in just a few weeks. So I just want to leave off in the, hold on, we have our contact information. Mm-hmm. So if there's any questions that you didn't get to ask, that you won't be able to ask today, please feel free to email us. Rachel's contact information can be found on the slide, as well as their social handles, if you want to communicate with us through that. And finally, just want to leave, while we do Q&A, the CE requirements up. And we do have a few questions. Great. I see that we only have 4 minutes, so I'll keep it tight. The first question is, how do I manage requests for accommodations on the job when I'm still learning day by day how to navigate my disability?
Wow. So that's a complex question. And I think, the first thing that I need to say is it's going to the approach that anyone is going to take is going to vary based on their job and the accommodations that they're looking for. And, you know, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that, well, two important things to keep in mind is that if you do qualify for accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you can ask for more than one. You don't have to limit it to one. So as the realities are revealing themselves, you can request what you know today. And then if something else comes up, you can request it again. And I would encourage you to not think of yourself as being a squeaky wheel or asking for a favor. It's not a favor. If you qualify for accommodations under the ADA, your employer is required to provide them when you ask for them, or to have a conversation with you about what an accommodation is going to look like. So I'm not an attorney. You definitely would want to consult with an attorney to find out whether or not you qualify for the ADA. But I will also say that if you don't qualify under the ADA, you should ask for accommodations anyway, because very frequently employers want to support good employees. They want to do everything in their power to make sure that the people that they know and trust are able to continue doing the fantastic work that they value so much. So as we like to say, the only guaranteed no is going to be to a question that you don't ask. So ask anyway, even if the law is not playing a role here.
No, 100%. And as you've mentioned, and we talk about frequently at CAC, these conversations are ongoing, and being able to make sure that you have that open communication with your supervisor, with your manager, whoever it is that you're having these conversations with, is extremely important, so that they know that things may change later on and it won't always be the same.
Absolutely. And I also want to quickly say, I can see some things happening in the chat box of people talking about accommodations and whatnot. And I love the helping spirit and the energy to contribute. What I do want to remind everyone is that whether or not someone qualifies for a reasonable accommodation is going to be very, very specific to their individual circumstances. And the way that requests get reviewed and processed and approved or not approved or adjusted or whatever it might be is very nuanced. And again, it's going to be very specific to the individual person, their disability, their job, their workplace. It's all very individualized. So it's very hard for us to give blanket advice as Cancer in Careers, and then also as you individually in your, to each other. Really, really, really recommend that you check with an attorney if you have questions, or some sort of legal expert who specializes in these things, who can take the time to look at the individual specifics of your case, let you know if you qualify, and then potentially be there to help you understand what you are entitled to on your side when you start having the conversation with your employer. I will also say that I'm going back to the legal resources that we have listed here, all of which are free. And the other thing that I will say is that I want to be very clear too, that we have heard so many stories over time of people who ask for something and it's not a problem and the employers do it. So many employers are invested in being supportive. So while I don't want to give the impression that that's always the case, sometimes there are challenges and it's horrible when that happens. Often things work out and go okay, and we just, it's a 1 or 2 conversations and it's done and we move on. So you don't know what your experience is going to be until you ask. Make sure that you're doing the work on your side to understand your individual circumstances and go from there.
Absolutely.
And I think I just ate up all of the time that we had, but it's such sticky territory when we get into the legal information.
It is.
So really felt like I had to do.
But it's important to mention all those things, because like things can be misinterpreted, and it's always good. Knowledge is power. It's always good to have all this information in hand. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at cancerincareers@cew.org. You also have Rachel's contact information on the slides that were shared before this presentation. Rachel, thank you again for a wonderful session. And thank all of you for joining us today. The evaluation will be shared for today's session will be shared in the chat box, and will also be emailed to everyone tomorrow before 5 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you all again for joining us, and I hope to see you in a few weeks for part 2. All right, bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.